He's Howard Ibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. And boy, are we going to talk about creative briefs and briefing today, because our guest is Jon Steel, author of Truth, Lies, and Advertising, one of the seminal books on planning. And he's going to tell us more. Let's join the conversation. Okay, Henry, we're back with another episode of the Brief Brothers. And today, I think we can honestly say we have a gentleman who needs no introduction, but we're going to give him one anyway. His name is Jon Steel. He is, for anyone of a certain age in our industry, a well-known person. If you're under a certain age, say under 40, you may not know him other than through his book, Truth, Lies, and Advertising. Jon got his start in 1984 at an agency called, help me out here, Boers, Massimi and Pollitt. Did I get that right, Jon?
Yes, Boers, Massimi, Pollitt.
BMP.
And that's BMP, and that is Stanley Pollitt, who is famous for having been, at least what I understood, one of the founders or the original thinkers, creators of account planning in the mid-60s, along with Stephen King. So you cut your teeth, Jon, with some very important people.
Yeah, I was very lucky.
So, I was, by way of introduction, to get the conversation started, I was sharing with a buddy of mine where I live here in Palm Springs, California, who was a lawyer for his entire career. And other than what he knows about advertising through our conversations, doesn't know any of the players in the business. But I went on and on about how the fact that you were going to be joining us today, he didn't know you. He had no idea who you were, but he understood from my enthusiasm that you're an important figure. And he said, okay, I don't know who this Jon Steel is, but my guess is it's like you're having Babe Ruth on the show. I said, that's as good an analogy as I can come up with. In our industry, we know who you are. And for those who are outside our industry, you're a major player, and Henry and I are really honored to have you. So Jon Steel, welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thank you very much for having me.
As I was saying before I hit the record button, Henry and I like to talk about the influences in our industry and how they impacted our immediate career. And I have a creative director or two who I still quote, and Henry has, people in his professional life that he does as well. When I left advertising as a practitioner, I went into teaching creative briefs. As I was saying to you, Jon, I don't write briefs. I'm the creative. You and Henry write briefs for me and my fellow creatives. I've written a couple of briefs because I've had to, but I got into this thing because I was tired of reading bad briefs, but no one ever said, that's a good brief, that's a bad brief. And this is the difference. I had to go learn that on my own. Lance Saunders, who's a guest on our show a few years ago, was the director of strategy at Campbell Mithun in Minneapolis. And he said, the first book you need to read is Truth, Lies, and Advertising by Jon Steel, because it's all about account planning. And that was my first introduction to some real heavy thinking about what goes into this document. And that's where I cut my teeth. And I since read other articles and watched YouTube videos and on and on and on with the things that we do when we're curious. And, one of the first questions that I've wanted to ask you, this book you wrote, Truth, Lies, and Advertising, which to many, I think, anyone in account planning and strategy would say is a Bible, one of the most respected textbooks on planning and brief writing. It's now 26 years old. And I pulled it out and started rereading sections of it in preparation for our talk today. And I'm saying, yeah, that's still true. That's still relevant. That's still smart. I'm going to talk. I haven't talked about this particular thing in a while. I'm going to steal this and talk about this and mention it. If you were to do this book today, what would you do differently? How would you go about it today, given your career?
I don't think I would go about it very differently at all. And Wiley, the publisher, have asked me on 2 or 3 occasions to write a second edition, some updated version of it, and I've always declined, because I don't think the main points that I make in the book I would make any differently at all. And I don't think I could come up with better examples to illustrate the points than the ones that I included in the book. And yes, they're old. And yes, they're old school advertising, their posters, their television, their newspaper or magazine campaigns. But I worked on all of them. I was part of the development of all of those ideas. And I know what really happened. And because I've not worked as a planner in one agency for a long time now, I would really struggle to find examples that I could use where I could be confident that I was telling the truth. I mean, you know as well as I do, in most agencies post-rationalize case histories. I tried to tell these exactly as they happened, warts and all, mistakes that we made, false starts. And I thought in writing the book that it was important to do that. At the time I wrote the book, I was still working at Goodby too, and I wanted to write about Goodby's work because that's where I was working and I was proud of it. And but it was more about the familiarity and the ability to tell the truth. And I've not worked consistently with one agency. In my time at WPP, I worked with a lot of different agencies, and it would have been very hard to have collected the same sort of level and depth of stories.
You work. Go ahead, Henry.
You've, in just the first answer to the first question, you've uncovered a few, I guess, big topics that are very close to my heart. One of which is the unfortunate fascination that the industry has with the newest thing. You know, we've already, in this few minutes we've been talking about account planning, which everybody knows is not the in way to talk about account planning anymore. Now it's strategy, as Howard mentioned, because we can't use a term that worked perfectly well before anymore because it's old. And you mentioned, you know, using old examples if they illustrate a point. And I was just watching a video of yours where you were talking about how the things that are really important don't change and haven't changed in thousands of years. And I'm in firm agreement with that. The other was the post-rationalization that happens, you know, with agencies, particularly in the realm of case studies and awards and all of that. And you know, advertising by its very nature is it's an organic process that is iterative, and you end up, you know, you go to the client says no for X, Y, and Z reason, and you hit your head on the wall, and sometimes that feedback is crap, but you have to come back with a new idea, and that iteration causes you to come up with a better idea, not because the feedback was great, but just because you had more time to think about it and go back and take another whack at the problem. So you know, I just think, I know that although our time is limited tonight, we could probably touch on a million subjects, but just those two already, I think, have been made it worth it. But yeah, I think the fascination with the new is something not just within account planning and the labels and the names, but within all of advertising. And I think it's really destructive to the industry that we always feel like that if we don't know the latest thing, then we're dead. I think Mark Ritson talks about it a lot, like the culture of death that exists in the trade press. You know, this is dead, that's dead. Yeah, the new thing. So I don't know if there's anything you want to react to in what I said, but
well, I agree. The industry's obsessed with the new and shiny, and you know, over the years, it's all about big data. It's all about programmatic. It's all about artificial intelligence. It's all about X, Y, Z. You know, you put your trendy word here. I've always been an account planner. I grew up in an agency that started account planning. I worked with lots of people who had the words account planner on their business cards, and there's a huge range of titles now that have to do with planning. planning was always about strategy. We didn't need the word strategy in our titles. Somebody said to me the other day, I'm having real trouble somebody who's out of work at the moment. He said, I'm having real trouble getting out of work because nobody seems to be interested in a sort of a creative planner, which is what I am. And I said, well, just call yourself a brand strategist and still do what you did as a creative planner. That's what I do. Just if you need a new label, put a new label on. But that obsession with labels and differentiation, and there's communication planners and digital planners and media planners, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all planners. And the problem is that the more of those variations of planners you have, the less responsibility for the brand any one of them has. And I always like to have one planner responsible for a piece of business, because that planner would be responsible for 100% of what needed to be done. The minute you put 2 planners or 3 planners on it, then each of them takes 30%, but it's usually the same 30% because that's the more interesting 30%, and the rest gets ignored. So just quick reactions to what you said, but I think the world's gone mad, really.
I'm curious to know, back up a little bit. You've made a joke in the biography at the end of the book, Truth, Lies, and Advertising.
God, what's coming now?
That's fun. That was very fun. It's like, how did you make the leap from your degree in geography to strategy?
I think the English education system, British education system, is very different to that in many other parts of the world, where people feel that they need to go study subjects that they're then going to follow professionally. It's changing somewhat in Britain, but I think the belief still lies there that education is an important thing, that education needs to educate, and that you need to sort of follow your passions and explore subjects that you enjoy and are interested in. So my degree was in geography, which I studied because I enjoyed field trips out to the mountains or the coasts or the glaciers, whatever we did. I was trained at BMP by an aeronautical engineer and a classics scholar. Subsequently, when I ran departments, I hired lawyers, doctors, killer whale trainers, you name it. And I've always believed that you needed to stock a planning department with people who came from very different backgrounds, each of whom had a different problem-solving approach to the others. And a history student or a geography student will have a very different problem-solving approach than that of an engineer or a psychology major. So it's all about variety and about having people in your agency and in your department who look at the world through a different lens.
We've talked
actually, I would add, geography was a very useful subject because it at degree level, it combined art and science in the same way that the advertising business combines art and science. So, I had the logical and analytical skills of the scientist, but I had the intuitive skills of the creative.
I think what you've described in your quest to hire a variety of people, though, summarizes what I think is one of the key qualities, attributes of a strategist or planner, and that's curiosity.
Yeah.
And I think Henry and I have talked about this before, that one of the most attractive aspects of the advertising industry is that it requires you to be kind of a Renaissance person. You may not have a deep knowledge of lots of things, but you have to have some knowledge. A working knowledge
of a lot of things.
Of a lot of things, and the ability to ask the right questions to learn more. Our very first episode, Henry and I said, well, what does it take to be a good brief writer? And Henry said, you have to be a writer. It's a writerly document. You have to be creative. And my answer was, you have to be a good listener, not just with your ears, but with your eyes. You have to pay attention to what's going on because you're observing consumers. We're trying to pay attention. I've always believed that the brief, one way of looking at the brief is that it's kind of a letter from the brief to the creative department. This is who I am. This is my problem. And maybe the project is going to solve the problem for me. Maybe not. Let's see if we can find a way to talk to me that way. I'm looking at the last sentence of your chapter on briefs from Truth, Lies, and Advertising. And it says, the bottom line is You don't have a good brief until you have a good ad.
Absolutely.
You want, can you, I mean, that's kind of like the summary of the entire chapter, but share your thinking about that.
Okay, let me just come back on one thing you said there before I answer that question specifically. Sure. I mean, in recruiting for the WPP fellowship, which I ran for many years, we used to say we were looking for interested people. Interesting people, and I used to define that as the kind of person I'd be happy to sit next to on a long haul flight for 8 or 9 hours, and the conversation we would have would be stimulating, and it probably wouldn't be about advertising directly, but they had to be interested in that they could find something interesting in anything. And occasionally I would have people in the agency say, well, I don't want to work on that. I mean, at Goodby, nobody wanted to work on the campaign that became Got Milk, because they said, it's boring, nobody's ever done good work on milk, why would we want to do that? You have to find people who can find something in disability insurance that makes people look at it in a different way, that makes creative people believe there's the opportunity to write something good, that makes people in the real world pay attention to it. So, you know, good planners are never bored. Okay, so just to come back on your points, you don't have a good brief till you've got a good ad. I've always believed that passionately. And I remember John Hegarty saying at a conference I was at when I was a young planner in London, somebody asked him what makes a good brief in his view. And he said, well, I look at it this way. He said, I take the main idea of the brief and I write it on a sheet of paper. I then draw a picture of the car or the coffee jar or the pair of jeans or whatever it is above it. And I sit back and I look at it and I think, is that an interesting juxtaposition? Does that give me the start of a good idea? And if it does, that's the first ad. I pin it up above my desk, and it's now my job as the creative director to write a better one. And I've always thought of, when I'm boiling a brief down, and I believe a brief should have a central idea in it. So I disagree with Paul on that. But I always try to think of it as a poster. Does it make sense as a poster? Is it as simple as a poster? If it's 7 words or less, you know, can I write it on the back of a postage stamp and have it make sense to somebody?
I was telling Henry this just a week or so ago. I have been telling that story about Sir John Hegarty, that you quoted him in your book for years. I've been telling that story for years.
We've told it a dozen times on this podcast, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it wasn't until I pulled your book down off my bookshelf a week or so ago and prepped for this talk that I wanted to make sure I got the story right. Because you know how when you tell a story over and over again, you embellish it, you change it.
Yes, exactly.
I've been true to your quotation, your story, verbatim. I haven't embellished. I haven't changed. It's like that's exactly what he did. And you quoted another planner as having overheard that conversation. Whoever heard it, whatever the source, it is a great definition to me of a brief. If that brief becomes the first ad, it's a good brief. It's a brief that a creative can work with. If you're staring at that line above or below a picture of the product and it's like, now what? You're in trouble. The brief is in trouble.
Yes.
So, I mean, I've heard a couple of definitions of a good brief. Henry and I talked about one. I got this from a marketer who said a creative brief is the emotional translation of the strategy. And we debated what we meant by strategy. I think we meant the brand strategy, not the business strategy.
Yes.
But what do you think of that definition?
Well, it reminds me, I talk a lot now about how the best insights, which for me need to lie at the heart of any brief, are where you manage to create a connection between a brand promise and a deeper human truth and a broader cultural truth. The deeper human truth being something timeless and, as Henry said earlier, things that have been true for thousands of years in terms of human emotion and the way we interact with each other and the world around us. And a cultural truth being a bit more about now, and the economic situation we're in, or the geographical truth of where we are. The brief brings all of those things together, and it takes a brand promise and humanizes it and personalizes it in an interesting way and an emotional way, probably. But I've always thought that the written brief is only a part of it, a small part of it. And for me, the briefing process was a lengthier and more iterative thing in which I would involve the creative people I was writing for. And there has to be a written brief at some point but sometimes I would write only half of that brief and then go to my creative partners and say, here's what I'm thinking, and I'm not sure whether I'm in the right place or not, but here's a half-assed idea. What do you think? And they would then become involved in the process of crafting the creative brief for themselves to write ads to. And it was interesting when you said, I've never written a brief. Well, I'm guessing you have, because of the sort of questions you would ask a planner who's coming to you with a brief. You've contributed to a better brief before you then go on and own the idea that you agree needs to be created. So you participate in that process, and it's very, very important for the creative people to have some ownership for it. And in the agency, people would often say to me, well, what about the creatives, or how are you going to present that to the creatives? As if the creatives were all the same person. They're not. Somebody once described the difference between Rich Silverstein and Jeff Goodby to me, and said, well, Rich is the nuclear explosion and Jeff is the radioactive fallout, which I thought was a brilliant characterization of their personalities, and defined very well how you had to work with them. Jeff was a slow burn, and you had to sit with him for a couple of hours and have a very lengthy, detailed conversation, out of which he would pick certain things that were useful to him. Rich, I had to see 20 times in a day, but for no longer than a minute at a time, because he just didn't have the attention span for it. And Rich was a pictures guy, and Jeff was a words guy. And they required a very different approach, as did every other individual in the creative department.
Let me just interrupt quickly to remind our viewers that you were the first director of planning in 1989 at Goodby. Is that, did I get the date right?
Yes. It was just after the earthquake in 1989.
Right, which I loved. You said in your biography was proof positive that you were indeed a planner, because you arrived 2 days after the earthquake.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So you were part of a major force in our industry in San Francisco, working on some major accounts. So I just want to remind our viewers of the contribution that you've made. So when you're talking about those two giants, our viewers recall and remember the context. So you want to talk about that experience for a moment of starting the planning department at Goodby Silverstein?
Yeah, it was not, like much of my career, it was accidental. I'd worked at BNP for 5 years. BNP bought a minority stake in Goodby. And part of the reason Goodby, Berlin and Silverstein, as it was then, sold a stake to BNP was they wanted some help with setting up a planning department. They'd looked at BNP's work and thought, that's the kind of work we want to be doing, but we probably need this thing called planning that they have. And when I went and met with them, it felt to me like it was a planning agency already, without planners being in it, because it had a philosophy that was very much about creating work that was distinctive enough to be noticed, but relevant in that it said the right things to the right people when it was noticed. And Jeff Goodby said to me, I asked him why he wanted planning in the agency. He said, well, I want somebody to say no to me. I want somebody whose job it is to say no, and I'll listen to that. He said, I won't always like it, but I'll listen. And he used to introduce me to clients and say, this is John, and he's got a right of veto on the work because it's got to be absolutely right for the people we've agreed are the audience. And funnily enough, I never used that veto at any point. in the 10 years that I worked at the agency, because we were always able to have the sort of conversations where I provided, and my job was to provide Rich and Jeff and other creative people and ultimately clients with all the information they needed to make an intelligent decision about what we were doing. And I was lucky to work with people who made intelligent decisions.
Yeah.
Not always the right ones. They made decisions, not always right.
I was just going to ask, was Goodby Silverstein one of the first U.S. agencies to adopt planning, to your knowledge?
One of the first. Chiat Day was the first. Jane Newman came over from BMP in London and set a department up for Jay. So both Jane and MT Rainey had been planning directors at Chiat Day before I came out to Goodby. I actually interviewed at Chiat Day a couple of years before I took the job at Goodby, when a guy called Rob White was the planning director in Los Angeles. But I chose not to because I was about to get married and it would have been too disruptive to my personal life. But I was keen to come to America because it felt to me like there was a chance to develop a different kind of planning in the US than existed in the UK at the time.
So just to get the timing straight, so planning really becomes a thing in the UK in the 70s?
Yeah, it started in about 1968, simultaneously at JWT and BMP in London. It became a big thing in the 1970s, which was the period where BMP really rose and became an important force in UK advertising. And then it started to spread out in the 80s to other
it's
markets.
Interesting. The reason I asked the timeline is because I started working in advertising in 96. And I worked at a small boutique agency that specialized in Hispanic advertising, and we didn't have a planning department. And at one point, my boss gave me, I had been, jack of all trades, being plugged into different departments at the agency for the first 3 or 4 years. And at one point, my boss gave me a big raise and he said, give yourself whatever title you want. And I didn't think he'd like it if I made myself president and CEO. So I started going through the Red Book to see different titles. And I started seeing this account planning and director of planning. And so I started investigating, well, what is this account planning? And I realized we didn't have it. And it was exactly what we needed. Like why does the client want this? And why do they think it should be done this way? And isn't there a better way? Like all those questions I started asking, I realized were the questions that a planner would ask. So
yeah, you became director of difficult questions.
Right? Correct. And then I basically made myself a planner, and then I had to go about learning, and that's how we get to you, because at the time there was no YouTube, there was no LinkedIn, there was no
thank God for that.
And if you worked at a big network agency, if you worked in WPP or something like that, there was training, right? But if you worked at a small independent shop like mine, there was really no training. So you had to go out and read books. Imagine that. And one of the only, and continues to be one of the best sources, was Truth, Lies, and Advertising. So that's my plug for the book. And I have it somewhere. I've moved my office and my home several times in the last few years, so it's probably in a box in storage somewhere.
Or it's underneath the bikes behind you.
Oh yeah. And so but thank you for that. But yeah, I was interested in the timeline because it seemed then, as it seems now, that they take advertising much more seriously in the UK than they do in the US. I mean, the Institute for Practitioners of Advertising tells you everything you need to know. Like, you consider yourself like a practitioner of something. I don't know that anybody uses the word practitioner when it comes to advertising in the United States. So I've always admired that. And I thought, if you're going to do something, then be serious about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I remember, Howard, you mentioned when you started, you didn't know what a good brief was, a bad brief was, and one of the things that I did.
Well, bad brief, yeah, I knew what a good bad brief was.
And when I became a planner, I needed to know that, and I realized that the most important part of my job was briefing. And I asked a creative team who I played soccer with, and the agency had a soccer team and a creative team who I got on pretty well with. I asked them if they would be willing to share briefs that they were working on for whatever clients in the agency, and let me have a go at writing ads. And I said, I'm not doing this because I have aspirations to be a copywriter, but I need to understand the effect that different kinds of briefing can have. And I went away, and they were willing to do it. I went away and I wrote ads and came back, and they'd tell me what was wrong with them and where they thought there were germs of good ideas and that sort of thing. And it was a very useful exercise, not just because it gave me a sense of what helped me as a writer create better advertising, but it also gave me a strong sense of what they regarded as a good idea or not. You know, what was a bigger idea, smaller idea. And I think that helped my understanding immeasurably. It helped my career too, because they then told everybody else in the creative department that there was a planner in the agency who actually gave a shit about what it was like writing ads. And
wow.
And that helped me be sort of accepted by a greater number of creative people in the agency, who were on occasion very hostile towards planners. But it was a great exercise, and it's something I've tried to get young planners to do in agencies ever since.
I'm going to steal that idea, John, and I'm going to give you credit. I have a TikTok page called Brief Bites, where I do 1 to 3 minute videos with little bits of advice on writing briefs. And that is a great idea. If you want to write a good brief for your creatives and you don't know how to write an ad, this will help. This is like walking a mile in another person's shoes.
Yes, which is what planners are supposed to do anyway.
Yes. Henry and I talk about that all the time. If you don't have empathy, if you don't try to understand what it's like for that customer in the middle of nowhere who needs to buy a tube of toothpaste, if you can't empathize with that customer, how do you write an ad? How do you write a brief for that? You have to have that kind. And I wanted to go ahead.
And I was just going to say, but that's why I always used to present briefs that were unfinished, because I needed the creative people I was working with to help finish them for themselves. It's psychologically, it's hugely different to have a brief foisted on you. Right, here it is, slip it under the door.
Yeah.
Go create a good campaign with that. Or here's 2/3 of the thinking. I need to talk with you about turning it into the full thing.
The first sentence on the chapter on the chapter called "A Good Brief Cannot Be Prepared in a Vacuum." There's a little subsection in your chapter on briefs. The first sentence reads, "I can say with complete confidence that the best briefs I have ever written have really been written by my creative colleagues."
Yeah.
It's collaboration. You've got half a brief, 3/4 of a brief, 2/3 of a brief. You've got the germ of an idea in a brief, and you bring it to your creative director, maybe 2 creative directors. And that's what Henry talks about, doing that all the time. I've said in my training, because I do workshops on writing briefs, I say, if you bring the creative brief to the briefing and the creatives are seeing it for the first time, it's too late.
Yes.
It's too late, because they have skin in the game. It's for them. If you don't get them involved in helping you write it, you're missing out on all kinds of insights. And you've taken it a step further with, I think, a piece of brilliant advice. Grab a brief that if your creatives like a particular brief, whether it's one that they're working on in the current agency, or it's something that they brought with them from their past experience, which is harder to do because briefs don't last very long. But give that assignment to a planner, have the planner write an ad to see if the brief inspires some kind of thinking. And if the planner can't do it,
So
yeah,
where my mind went when you were talking about that exercise is something that I like to do as I'm finalizing a brief, which is pressure test it by trying to see if I could come up with advertising ideas of my own based on that brief, not with the
Yes.
intention of selling them to the creatives as something that they would want to make, but just to prove to myself that this does have legs, that whatever direction of thinking that I have can be executed. I always call it the in trademark dumb planner idea as a kind of like a proof of concept. Like, this brief does hold water. But you also bring up an interesting point, which is that it helps if they have ownership, right? And I could imagine that for a planner, and I'm sure, and I know I've been there, to come to a briefing with a brief that you're all excited about, you think you've uncovered something, and you're really, and it lands with a thud, and they just don't see it or don't get it. I think by having them help you complete the brief, you avoid, not only are you likely to get a better brief, but you're also likely to experience that personal rejection and pain of, we don't get it.
Yeah. Well, I never used to get excited about anything until I knew somebody else was excited about it.
Well, Henry likes to say that a good planner also has to be humble, because he will write a brief. Henry will write a brief, deliver it to the creatives. The creatives will go off and come back with ideas that Henry had no concept of, and actually didn't. The creatives will say to him, well, we liked your brief, but we went off in an entirely different direction, and we think these ideas are good. And Henry will agree and say, I have to rewrite the brief.
So yeah, that goes back to what we talked about earlier about it being an organic and iterative process, right? So I depart with the point of view on a brief. They go and ideate, and in the course of coming up with an execution, they stumble into a deeper insight or something more meaningful. And I, as a strategist, have to be open and attuned to, oh, this is much more powerful than what I had thought of before on the brief, and be willing to blow the whistle and say, hey guys, I think this is really where we're at. Forget about all this other stuff I said before. This seems like the direction we need. And I have specific examples where that has been the case, where in looking at that first round of work, I questioned the brief or took it to a different direction, and we all agreed and pivoted. So I think that that's something that you, as a strategist, when I say that I want to be humble, is you can't be married to the words on a piece of paper that you wrote in the course of doing a creative exercise, because the magic of it is you don't know where it's going to end up. And that's one of the big challenges that I have with, and this is actually the genesis of this podcast, was Howard presented me with a paper that the ANA did about brief writing, and they talked about how the client and the agency should collaborate on the creative brief. And I told him,
brief instead of two different briefs.
Yeah, and I said, Howard, that's very nice thinking, but in practice, it's a nightmare, because the clients want to adjudicate and parse every word on a brief, and that's not what a brief is for. They want to throw every single piece of data into a brief. Like, their mindset is different than who the brief is intended for, and that's my job. So I just understanding that this is a living thing that we can change on the fly, and it's a product that's internal to the agency, I think is important. But the strategist also needs to be humble enough to say, hey, let's move on from where we started.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Henry. I think that the client needs to inform the brief, obviously, and a vital part of any briefing exercise is your understanding of the brand. But first of all, your understanding of the problem that needs to be addressed, which is not always the problem that the client gave you in the first place. But then it's a process that is an internal agency one. You cannot have clients editing word by word. I've, as I said at this earlier in our conversation, I've actually changed the way I write briefs now, and I no longer write the series of questions that I had in my book. Those questions still guide what I'm writing, but I usually write a 1 or 2 page prose piece in which I've got some buried explosive devices, that I'm putting my ideas, any ideas that I have that might push somebody in the right direction, I've got hidden in the writing. And sometimes it's an idea that I've written about the target. Sometimes it's in the actual sort of strategy part of it. It's just words that I've included because I think they might just be catalytic. And at the end of it, a creative person might say, well, I've got a really good idea from that. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's sort of the direction I wanted them to go in, but I can't claim credit for it. And I think it's, talking of humility, it's your job as a planner never to claim credit for anything that you've worked on, because ultimately the ideas have to be created and owned by those who write and art direct the advertising.
You said something there that, or a couple of things that I think are really instructive, and one is, I think even in the old format, right, of the 7 or 8 questions, I think it is true that the idea, we have this saying that we say it's not the questions, it's the answers that you give that are important, right? So like the format of the brief is less important because most briefs, regardless of the wording, are getting at similar things like who's this target audience, like who are they really, what's the problem we need to solve, etc. But the good idea, or the sellable idea, could come out of it from some word that you used in a target description. It could come out of some word that you used in the mandatories or the considerations. I think your no format, your prose format, is the same. I mean, I think what it does is it kind of just blurs the lines so that it doesn't feel like everything's just in a little box, and that I should only be looking at that single-minded proposition, which is, I think,
Exactly.
what ends up happening is, if it doesn't respond to the single-minded proposition, and what you're saying is, let's blur some of the lines around that box. It's really a brief in its totality, and there's probably a few areas where we can depart from for really good ideas. And I love that you used explosive device, because the other part is they're not all going to go off, and you don't know which one, and you don't know which one is going to go off.
No, the creative people are going to step over some of them. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fascinated too, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard agencies or marketers say, well, we've just done a complete redo of our creative brief template. It's like,
whoopee-doo.
Yeah. Why? What was wrong with your other template? There's nothing. I mean, the only thing I would question on a template is whether the template sets up questions or topic areas. If it's a topic description, I would say change it to a question, because questions provoke different kinds of thinking.
Because a question requires an answer.
Yes, and it triggers different kinds of thinking than a topic description. And Henry, my buddy Henry, does both, which I think is pretty cool. But the point is, why are you messing with a template when it's the answers that matter? But that's one, like the new and shiny thing we talked about at the very beginning of our conversation. This is one of the things we obsess about.
The only usefulness, well, or not the only, but I think that there is a usefulness in certain templates in that they can help the agency kind of create, and this is very, business oriented to the age, create like the black box about what this agency's particular way of thinking is about advertising, right? Like, so I've seen, that Crispin Porter and Bogusky, I was working at an agency on the interagency team. I wasn't working at Crispin, but this was at the height of Crispin. On Burger King, I was working at the Hispanic agency, and they had this 4-box brief format that had its benefits and, in my opinion, had its shortcomings. But what it certainly did was it created kind of this is the Crispin way of doing things. This is how we think
Yes.
about advertising problems. And then, of course, the magic wasn't in the template. It was in the creatives that they had working 24/7 here in Miami, coming up with those ideas. So, but I do think it could be a marketing tool in some senses for an agency that has a good
Yeah.
strategy department. And
Yeah, and if I were in an agency now, I would still counsel young planners to use the questions that I ask in the book. Why are we advertising? What are we trying to achieve? Who are we talking to? What do we know about them that will help us, and so on. But I've just learned as over the years I've become a better writer. I've learned that I could use the power of good writing to sort of influence direction as well, and it's easier to write in flowing prose than it's easy. Good writing is easier to attain when you're writing in flowing prose than when you're writing in answers in boxes.
We've had a guest on who you may know, Cameron Day, son of Guy Day of Shy Day fame, who's written a series of books on helping creatives manage their careers. And he says what he likes to do when he's a freelance creative, he's a writer and a creative director. When he gets a freelance brief and he's not obviously as into the brand as deeply as those who work at the agency, what he'll do is he'll take the brief and he'll write what he calls a mantra. It's a response to the brief. And it's all in prose.
Yeah.
And he said he's often shared that with the client, and they say, well, we like this better than the brief. So it makes perfect sense.
That's interesting, yes.
It makes perfect sense. It's like, I'm just going to write out what I'm thinking. What does this brand mean to me? What does the problem seem to be communicating to me? Who are we talking to here? Because I think the danger in among a lot of brief writers is that they write in a kind of marketing speak, and they use bullet points rather than just talk to me as a creative in everyday conversational language. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
So,
but I think the everyday language is really important, and that's the questions that we used to ask at Goodby, which are the ones in my book, are in plain, simple English, and they require answers in plain, simple English. I've got no tolerance for jargon of any sort. Because you're talking, ultimately, this is supposed to stimulate advertising that's to work in the real world, and if it has no place in the real world, it has no place in the brief.
When you were at Goodby, you were working on the Got Milk campaign. You were mentioning before you were looking for people who were interesting and interested in being interesting. I think I said that correctly.
Interesting and interested.
Interesting and interested. I have done creative brief workshop training where there were multiple representatives. The ANA is the Association of National Advertisers. It's the largest client side trade group in the country, and I work on the faculty of the Marketing Training and Development Center. So we have these workshops where small numbers of multiple ANA members will show up for a training. So there could be 30 or 40 different brands represented in one large group. And one of the questions I often asked in that setting is, how many of you here think you work on a boring brand? And I'm stunned every time I ask that, because 25 to 30% of the people will raise their hand. These might be insurance companies or what. And I say to them, you know what? There's no such thing as a boring brand. There's only boring brand advertising. If I had the opportunity to work on Coca-Cola or Toyota Earth Movers, I'm going to go to Toyota Earth Movers, because there's a larger creative opportunity for me. I don't know if I'll be able to move the needle on Coke. I mean, I'm a pretty good creative, but bell curve applies to every profession. And I'm definitely not in that top 1%. I'll be honest enough to admit that. I'm in the middle. So I'm not sure I'm going to come up with a creative idea that's going to move the needle on Coke. I could feel more confident about working on a brand like a Toyota Earth Mover, a little backhoe, because there's just seems to be more creative opportunities. So I'm interested, when you were working on the Got Milk campaign, did you have trouble finding people who wanted to step up and work on that project? Clearly not, because you did some great work.
Well, when we initially pitched it, there were a lot of people went to Jeff Goodby, who was running the pitch, and said, well, Jeff, what the hell are we doing this for? Nobody's ever done any good work on milk. It's just all formulaic stuff about calcium and bones and good for your teeth. And Jeff said, well, isn't that the point? Like, if nobody's done any good work on it, there's an enormous opportunity for us to do some. And if we don't, people will go, oh, they never had a chance. So we can't lose. And some of the people who'd been most vociferous in their criticism of us selling out by doing this pitch, within 6 months were begging to be able to work on it. And there were enough of us who could see the opportunity at the start to create the Got Milk campaign and get it up and running. And then there were lots of other people who were miraculously converted.
We've used this example on the podcast many times, but before the Ultimate Driving Machine, BMW was a nowhere brand in the United States. It wasn't until some gifted creative got their hands on it, and then it was part of a pitch, an agency that was going out of business, and they came up with this idea of the Ultimate Driving Machine, and ultimately became the #1 import vehicle in America for a long stretch.
Yes.
And so the only thing that changed, obviously a lot of things change over the decades, but at that moment in time, the only thing that changed was the advertising. But suddenly the brand was perceived differently by the general public, and that created the conditions under which it would eventually become the #1 imported brand. The other one that we talk about is Old Spice. Old Spice, a brand that had been around forever. And in 2006, it was moribund. It was dying, and Wyden and Kennedy got their hands on it. They got to pitch it, and they've completely revitalized a brand. So not sexy. It wasn't sexy. Now it's sexy. Now everybody wants to work on Old Spice, but back then, Old Spice was your grandfather's aftershave.
Yes.
So I think that those are examples. The other one we talk about is Geico. Geico's old company. They did, it wasn't just the advertising, they also kind of changed their business model, but the advertising was what worked hand in hand with that new business model to drive the phone calls to the direct sales center. So those are all examples where the brand wasn't sexy before and it became sexy after.
Yes.
And it was the advertising that did it.
But some people ask me, like, what are you most proud of, the work you've done? And I think overall the work I'm proudest of is the stuff that represented what seemed like the biggest challenge at the time. And these were brands or organizations that were not sexy, they were not attractive. It was very difficult to engage people in talking about them. But if you engage them in the right way, you can get to something interesting. And some of the most disappointing experiences of my professional life are on brands that a lot of people would give their right arm to work on, but they were difficult, and the distance you could travel with them was really very, very small, if at all.
You could hear them saying, yeah, we did that before. We did that before.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk about one topic, because I know we're running down on time, but I want to talk about one topic in terms of planners. And it's been my experience that in every agency, and I've been at, I want to say 6 different agencies, 4 different holding companies. At every agency I've been at, my role has shifted depending on the nature of the creative personnel that are at the agency. In other words, I have to hold some people's hand a little more. In other cases, my role was, that wasn't as required. And so I think being a little bit of a chameleon is a good trait for a strategist, to really be able to fill in the gaps that exist in the agency to make the whole, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's your job to create the environment in which people are going to have their best ideas, and creating that environment has different requirements from one agency to another. It was, I suppose, easier for me when I went to Goodby, because I knew that Jeff and Rich and others wanted to involve people in the real world in the process of developing their advertising. They were committed to that. So anything I could do to bring those people into the agency was welcomed. And sometimes less welcome was the response when we took out rough ideas and showed it to people. But it helped us make our advertising effective as well as creative. And I must say, an observation I have of planning around the world now is that not enough planners get out enough. There's a whole sort of generation of Google planners has developed, where you think you're doing your research and understanding your market by just searching stuff. The planning I did and the planning I encouraged others to do had us out of the agency an awful lot of the
in
time.
the store aisles.
And in the store, in people's homes, watching the way people shopped milk,
Yeah,
and
it's not,
you didn't have to.
It's not because they're not going to turn to you and say something that's going to become this insightful thing that'll be in your brief. You're just going to see them living their lives in the way the product or the service fits or doesn't fit. That's all it's going to be.
And it's really important to use your eyes and your ears in understanding that stuff. But it's also important to have the right conversations with people. And for me, planning is a simple thing. You've just got to ask the right people the right questions in the right place at the right time. And there are campaigns that I was involved with where one thing that one person said in one focus group was the lightning rod for the idea. When somebody wrote the word asshole on a sheet of paper to describe the way they were thinking about a Porsche driver pulled up against next to them at the stoplight. One word, one person, but everybody else said immediately, that's what I think about the brand. That's what I think about people who drive those cars. And it turned into a campaign where, as Porsche executives said for years afterwards, we are addressing the asshole factor. We need to make this brand more likable. Never mind the engineering, never mind all of these other things that we've been talking about. If people don't like you because you're driving this car, that's got to change. But in moderating that focus group, I had to create the environment in which that person felt comfortable enough to say that thing. Because Porsche they'd got rooms wall to wall, floor to ceiling full of research. But nobody'd ever asked that question.
Yeah.
And nobody'd ever felt comfortable enough saying that thing that actually defined Porsche's advertising for years to come and saved the company.
Yeah, you said somewhere in your book about the fact that a brief isn't about I'm paraphrasing, but a brief is not designed to be a love letter about the brand. It's about being authentic and real. So I'd like to, I think maybe we can wrap up our conversation here. If you can, do you recall, I've got this line highlighted in your book where you said the Joe Montana of brief writers. Now that's something to aspire to. Do you recall that story about Joe Montana? Could you share that with us again and talk about what the message was about the simplicity? Do you recall? I can quote it to you.
I recall it. And it was Joe Montana being interviewed about the 2-minute drill. And okay, Joe, you're 6 points down. You're at your own goal line. You've got 2 minutes. Do you think it's important to complete your first pass so everybody on the other team thinks, oh my God, here comes Joe on the 2-minute drill again. He's just completed the pass to Jerry Rice, and now the world's going to fall apart. I think this is the story you're asking for, right?
Yes, exactly.
And Joe said, no, I just think it's better to complete a pass than not complete a pass. And this is the same man who in the Super Bowl, just before he, threw the winning pass, got into the huddle, and everybody's like, right, what's Joe going to tell us? And he goes, is that Tom Arnold and Roseanne Barr sitting over there? And everybody turns around and they look, yes, Joe, that is Tom Arnold. He said, okay, all right, well, I'm going to throw it to John Taylor. Let's go. But
so
he kept everything simple.
kept it simple. Yeah. Yeah. It's just, we have this enormous capacity, we in our industry, and I don't think we don't think we have a monopoly on this, but we have this enormous capacity to take things and overcomplicate the shit out of them. Right.
Yes.
What,
I mean, I've always thought there are two kinds of people in the world. There are complicators and there are simplifiers. And in the agency world, there's probably about 5% of people are simplifiers. The rest do everything they can to sort of show off how much work they've been doing and add layer upon layer. And I do a lot of work with brands where I sort of help them understand their vision and values. And those have generally, they've been there, but they've been forgotten. And it's like an archaeological exercise. It's just my job to like remove the layers of dust and find something that's been buried and out of sight for a long time. And it's the reason it has been buried and out of sight is that people have spent years complicating it.
Yeah.
yeah. Was
The
it
complicators and simplifiers. I love that. We've talked a lot about, in essence, the exercise of writing a brief is a reductionist exercise. It's getting rid of everything that doesn't matter and just finding the one thing or couple things that do matter. And
Yeah,
there's so much.
Mark Twain is famous for having said, "I apologize for writing such a long letter. If I'd had more time, I would have made it shorter."
Yes, and I've always loved that apocryphal sculpture story, which sometimes attributed to Picasso, sometimes to others, where the visitor to his studio says, "What's that rock for in your studio?" And Picasso goes, "Well, I'm going to use it to sculpt a lion." And the visitor says, "Wow, gosh, what an intimidating thing. How do you approach that? You know, this large unhewn boulder." And he said, "It's easy. I just take a chisel and I chip off all the bits that don't look like a lion." and I think it's our job as brief writers we've got this massive information. It's our job to chip away and remove all of the pieces of information that don't look like a good brief or don't look like a good idea.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it takes a few years of experience to really hone that skill. So you have to really practice that. Yeah.
It's not unfortunate. What's unfortunate is that I think the environment to learn those skills is less and less, or definitely less now than 20 years ago. I don't see within the agencies we've lamented this many times, the degree of training. You know, in a way, the good strategists that come out today, it's a credit to them because they are self-taught. You know, they're just smart people that get it, which is fine. But it would be better if we empowered those people and kind of mentored them and showed them the way.
And that's always been an important part for me of building a department. And when I started at Goodby, I was the only planner. I was head of a department that just had me in it, so I was my own boss, and that's
been easy. Most of my career.
But then I had another planner came to work for me, and we worked closely together on everything. And then eventually we could afford to get another one, but that new person then worked with me and the first planner. And like at every stage of the way, they're learning from people more experienced than them. So my young planners would always work with 3 or 4 planning directors, to be able to extend the work that the planning directors were able to do, but B, so they could learn from each of them and take the best bits from each of them. Because, you know, one of my planning directors might be better quantitatively than the others. One might be a better qualitative researcher. One might be a better brief writer. One might be a better presenter. And you need to take the best of each of them to become more of the complete planner. But that training, it never ends. And hopefully, I mean, the good planners continue to learn and continue to develop their skills, but around a core set of skills that are vital for anybody to do a proper job in developing advertising. I don't think those skills have changed at all.
And I would say that to wrap this up, your book, Truth, Lies, and Advertising, remains a seminal teaching tool for anyone, whether you want to be a strategist or a creative or any role in the advertising business. It's a great teaching tool. Well, I can say now with complete honesty that I've had a chance to speak with the Babe Ruth of our industry. Jon Steel, this has been a wonderful experience.
Pleasure.
A true pleasure and a true honor. Thank you so much for joining Henry and me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good stuff, Henry.
Great stuff, Howard.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Ibach. And together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.